After yesterday's win against the Jacksonville Jaguars, head coach Antonio Pierce was asked a very interesting question about the number one overall pick and basically winning against the Jags and having that one pick kind of fall down. And he was asked his thoughts on this. And based off of his answer, some people think there's real beef between Tom Telesco and Antonio Pierce. Some people are saying the two guys don't get along, and maybe it's kind of hinting to Antonio Pierce not actually being here going forward. Check out what was ultimately said, and we'll talk about it on the other side.
Coach, for the part of Raider Nation that is focused on the first overall draft pick conversation, what is your response to them?
Talk to Tom Telesco.
So there you guys have it, right? Obviously, Antonio Pierce is kind of putting it out there that they don't really care about the draft, right? Like, that doesn't really impact them. And when asked specifically, he said, go talk to Tom Telesco about that, right? And then today he was, kind of followed up a little bit on that and said, we don't care about fantasy football. We don't care about draft position. And for us, we care about wins and losses for the season, right? Nothing else really impacts us. And I understand that Tom Telesco and Antonio Pierce have two different jobs, right? Antonio Pierce cares about wins and losses. He doesn't care about the draft position. Antonio Pierce has no say anyways on the quarterback and those type of things. But Tom Telesco and Antonio Pierce may not actually be on the same page because Tom Telesco didn't really hire Antonio Pierce, right? And what's interesting is some people are now saying that all the rumors and reports over the past 2 to 3 weeks are potentially true. The Raiders are potentially looking to move off of Antonio Pierce, and Pierce may even understand kind of where he's at. And the way he kind of sarcastically answered that question may actually be a hint to it. Now, I want to show you guys some of the reports that have come out over the past couple of weeks. There was one that came from the owners' meeting about 2 weeks back. Apparently, Mark Davis said that both Antonio Pierce and Tom Telesco will be evaluated separately once the offseason arrives, right? So essentially, these two guys, they're not paired nor are they tied together. The last two regimes that the Raiders have had, the first being obviously Mike Mayock and John Gruden, were kind of tied together. The fact that Mike Mayock wasn't he wasn't the guy that 100% decided everything, right? It was mostly John Gruden. We know Mike Mayock obviously had some input, but those guys are essentially tied together. Dave Ziegler, Josh McDaniels were definitely tied together. They're hired in the same year. They're hired from the same organization and kind of brought over here. This new regime is not tied together, right? Antonio Pierce kind of comes from that Dave Ziegler, Josh McDaniels era, but at the same time, Tom Telesco has nothing to do with that, and Tom Telesco is completely separate. And Mark Davis had to clarify, right? He had to put it out there that those two guys come off season will be evaluated separately. One of the things that I see happening right now a lot is people are very critical of Tom Telesco, and it kind of doesn't make sense to me because a general manager is not coaching, right? A coach coaches the football team. The general manager makes the roster moves, right? If a team has a good roster, which the Raiders do have a really, really good roster right now, if a general manager puts a good roster together, it's not going to lead to wins and losses unless the coach is actually able to do that, right? At the same time, you might have a roster that's not very good, but then the coach gets the most out of it, right? And sometimes that kind of speaks to how good a coach actually is relative to the general manager. The Raiders have put together a good roster. Now, we are obviously missing a quarterback. We're missing a running back. And because we traded Devontae Adams, we're missing a wide receiver one or a true X wide receiver. But I think Tom Telesco, given the fact that he was just hired, he had one draft, he had one offseason, and he has to fix the cap, he has to make sure everything's good as he kind of goes forward. I think Tom Telesco's done a really, really, really good job. And again, it's crazy because some people are saying that Tom Telesco has not done a good job, and the Raiders got to somehow fire this guy, which makes no sense to me, right? In order for Tom Telesco to be able to have success, he needs 3, 4, 5 years to be able to implement the strategy that he's thinking. Right? It's not as easy as just going out there and getting a quarterback right away and think he's going to just work out. Right? That would be the wrong way to do it. I think what Tom Telesco did in the first offseason, what he might be able to do this offseason as we kind of go into next season, will tell us a lot about Tom Telesco. But there was another report as well. This one was by Josina Anderson. And this is separate than Mark Davis actually telling us things, right? Mark Davis, what Sean retweeted was something Mark Davis told us specifically. This one comes out by Josina Anderson, who's a really, really good insider. And she essentially put it out there that the Raiders are currently entertaining the idea of getting a new head coach, while general manager Tom Telesco is simultaneously separating himself behind the scenes. To me, that's an interesting report. And this isn't new, right? These two reports with what Mark Davis said about the two guys being separate, about Tom Telesco separating himself from Antonio Pierce, right? And that the Raiders are entertaining the idea of getting a new head coach. tie that in with the fact that Antonio Pierce answered the way he ultimately answered about the draft. Go talk to Tom Telesco. To me, it makes sense that there is something going on between the two guys. Now, obviously, that's a little bit of speculation, but however you look at it, the Raiders are not tied to Antonio Pierce long term. Yes, Antonio Pierce is under contract for one more year. He had a 2-year contract with the Raiders. He is tied to the Raiders one more year, but for Mark Davis, you can get out of the Antonio Pierce contract, and it's really not that big of a deal, right? Yeah, it's 1 year. Yeah, Mark Davis is losing money, but if the difference is you go out and get Ben Johnson, right? You hire the best offensive coordinator that could be the next great head coach. It makes sense to go out there and get that guy and ultimately allow him to run your entire team from the coaching element of it, right? If the Raiders can get a great head coach, why not go out there and get it? Antonio Pierce isn't a terrible coach, but he's also not a play caller on either side of the football. So he will always be reliant on those guys calling plays. And to me, if you have a great offense, a great play caller, a guy that can kind of get it done, it makes a big difference. We're seeing even the Raiders on the offense side of the football designing better plays now than when Luke Getsy was ultimately brought in. And if you think about it, Antonio Pierce was the guy that hired Luke Getsy. So you can kind of think about that decision right there being one of Antonio Pierce's decisions. That was the wrong one. There's no guarantee he's going to make the right pick coming up in the next season. I think if Tom Telesco did decide that we need to move off of Antonio Pierce, I think it personally makes sense. Now, talking a little bit about the actual draft, the more I thought about the fact that the Raiders dropped down from the number 1 pick downwards, the more I started to think that, it's not guaranteed that a quarterback goes 1, 2, and then that's it. There's no quarterbacks left, right? We've had multiple drafts over the years where, just going back, 2019, people were talking about Kyler Murray. They're talking about Drew Lock. They're thinking about Dwayne Haskins. And they're like, one of these 3 quarterbacks in the number 1 overall pick. The other 2 will end up going top 10 regardless. And we only got 1 first-round quarterback in that draft, right? And the thing is it's not always guaranteed that you're going to get multiple quarterbacks to go 1, 2, and 3, right? It's not ever guaranteed. In 2022, people were talking about Kenny Pickett, Malik Willis, and there was a couple other guys, right? I think Hendon Hooker mayhap came out in that year as well. People were talking about these guys, and they're like, one of these guys is going to go the first overall, the next guy will go second or third, and then, we'll get like 3 quarterbacks in the top 10, and that didn't happen in 2022, right? Malik Willis was like a 4th-round pick. Hendon Hooker was a 2nd-round pick. Kenny Pickett was a 20th overall pick, but none of those guys have worked out. None of those guys are starting quarterbacks today. Even the year before 2022, right? If you go back to 2021, we had 5 quarterbacks go in the top 15, and 4 of those 5 quarterbacks are already on new teams. The only quarterback that at least has somewhat of upside is going to be Trevor Lawrence, who's the number 1 overall pick that year. So quarterbacks are not given that if you draft one, you're going to have success. And it's also not given that teams are just willing to take a quarterback in the top 3 or 4 picks. You look at the Colts who took Anthony Richardson. Yes, he was the 3rd quarterback in that draft, but that hasn't really worked out for him. And they're in the 2nd year with him at this point, and he doesn't really look that good, right? On the other end of it, you look at Bryce Young, CJ Stroud. Those guys are having success, but it's not always guaranteed. You look, years before that where Jordan Love was a late 1st-round pick. Jalen Hurts was a 2nd-round pick. You look at a couple years prior to that, right? Like Josh Allen and Patrick Mahomes were not the 1st overall pick. So it's not guaranteed that you have to take a quarterback with the 1st overall pick for him to be a good quarterback. And oftentimes the 1st quarterback picked isn't even the best quarterback, right? So I think as the Raiders kind of finish out this season, we're not going to have the 6th overall pick because both the Titans and Jags play one another this upcoming week. So one of those teams will end up winning, and they'll end up dropping behind the Raiders. So the Raiders, if they lose against the Saints coming up here, the Raiders will end up jumping at least to pick 5, and then we don't even know what's going to end up happening in the last week, right? Teams can always win. Teams can always lose out. And the strength of schedule is always changing as well. So, again, the Raiders can end up having the 3rd overall pick, the 4th overall pick, which could still put you in range to get a Shedeur Sanders or a Jalen Milroe, right? Depending on which quarterbacks end up coming out. To me, I think the best thing the Raiders can do at this point is just be conservative with the approach. If Tom Telesco does choose to fire Antonio Pierce, and he does choose to ultimately take one of these quarterbacks, you got to have a good coach to coach these guys up. And honestly, there's good coaches out there, right? There's a couple of really, really good coaches out there that coach offenses that I would personally trust with that decision to develop these guys. And, your offensive coordinator will always have the biggest impact, regardless of what quarterback you end up taking, right? You can look at Kyle Shanahan taking a Brock Purdy in the 7th round, right? And him having a lot of success. You can look at the fact that he had success with Jimmy G. You can look at the fact that Sean McVay had success with Jared Goff, traded him away, brought in Matthew Stafford, and won a Super Bowl with him, right? And truth be told, when Matthew Stafford retires or leaves the Rams in the next couple of years, Sean McVay will probably find another quarterback and have success with that guy as well, right? Matt LaFleur, you go from Aaron Rodgers, you go to Jordan Love, and you kind of go forward with that, and they're having success as well, right? So again, good offensive coordinator is always going to be the most important concept. And then it's not guaranteed that the best quarterback was number 1 overall, right? We saw it even just this past season where some people think Bo Nix is the best quarterback, and he was the last quarterback taken, right, of the first round guys. And then even more than that, people are saying Caleb Williams is probably like the 3rd quarterback, even after Nix and then Jaden Daniels as well, who's having success. So again, nothing's guaranteed. We'll see what ends up happening as we kind of go forward. I do think the Raiders should still take a quarterback, 3rd, 4th, 5th overall pick, even if, it's Jalen Milroe. Unless they're 100% confident Milroe will be there in the 2nd round, then maybe you target him in the 2nd round. Raiders got to get a quarterback. There's no way you can go into next season with the guys you ultimately have. I wouldn't be mad if the Raiders said, hey, let's take Josh Connerly with the 5th overall pick, or let's take Travis Hunter, although he probably won't be there, or Tetroa McMillan out of Arizona. I wouldn't be mad if the Raiders went down that list. Now, I will say this. I have reservations with taking Ashton Genty, the running back out of Boise State. I know he's a great running back. He'll probably have a lot of success. But a running back position is the position you can easily find as long as you invest in it, right? I think we've talked about this multiple times. And I think most people with common sense also kind of understand the concept. Running backs are generally interchangeable as long as you put the investment in. Right? This year, we're going to have 3 first-round running backs. We'll have another 3 that go in the 2nd round. We'll have another 3 or 4 that go in the 3rd round. And all 12 of those running backs are going to be really good running backs in the NFL, right? And the truth with kind of how the run game works is if you have a good offensive line, if you have a good scheme, if your run game coordinator is legit, you'll have success with that position as well. So I wouldn't be upset if the Raiders went best player available. Connerly, Abdul Carter, Travis Hunter, Will Johnson, right? I think we could shore up the cornerback position if we really wanted to in this class as well. Nate Hobbs is a free agent. We might not be able to bring him back. Maybe you move Jack Jones to the inside. You put Will Johnson on the outside. And then you got 3 really good corners, right? Or guys with potential and upside. And then maybe you take a quarterback in the 2nd round. Or maybe you get Kirk Cousins. The Raiders have options at the end of the day. I know the win isn't the best thing for the actual draft status. Something tells me Antonio Pierce will not be here at the end of the year. We'll see what actually ends up happening. Let me know what you guys think, man. Thumbs up, subscribe, and I will see you guys next time with another video.